everybody, welcome to Monday. Today I'm doing some follow-up questions that came out of Boss Fight episode 4. Specifically one thing about, the self-reporting and what do we know about the effect of video games that isn't self-reported, and the other is on power fantasies. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Going to do the brain stuff first, power fantasy second. If you like this sort of content, help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK. Okay, so one of the questions was getting around self-reporting. Do we know anything that isn't self-reporting? Has there been anything involving brain scans? I got into this some in Boss Fight episode 1. Short version for people that don't want to go back and watch it, though I suggest you do, because you might see some of the foreshadowing now planted. But basically, the brain scan stuff surrounding video games falls into basically two main buckets. One is its measures of dopamine to try to show some sort of addictive tendency of video games, which failed fairly horribly because the increase in dopamine from like baser resting levels that you get from a video game is similar to any pleasurable reward activity. Dopamine about doubles compared to something like heroin or cocaine when it's like 10 times that. There's just no comparison, right? Drugs hijack the dopamine response in a way that video games just don't. And, this comes into interpreting data. Data can say a set of things and, different people can look at it and see different things in that data. Of course, some interpretations are just objectively more accurate than others. And that brings to the next bucket of stuff some preliminary findings of studies that are ongoing, in part just because, the technology to safely scan the brain is fairly new. There was a study that did sort of preliminary findings back in 2018. It's a 10-year study of thousands of kids. They're basically going to scan these kids' brains at intervals and see what screen use does to those. So we'll get some reporting in 2028. Gonna be waiting a while. But the preliminary findings found that kids who use screens more had a thinning of the cortex of the brain, which is usually what happens when brains mature. Now, is that a bad thing? Nobody knows yet. Is that a good thing? Maybe even possibly. Point is, we don't know. They found a whole bunch of other cognitive effects of games. A lot of them are potentially good, but it's not like screen use and games. The buckets are too big, as I talked about in the show. That games that challenge visual acuity and attention, like hand-eye coordination, they activate the parts of the brain involving visual acuity and hand-eye coordination. Games that involve spatial memory, like Match 3 or anything like that, activate the parts of the brain involved in spatial memory, right? So puzzles are one thing, hand-eye coordination and reaction time are other thing. Video games they've shown improvement in some cognitive abilities that they way oversold in some apps like brain games and stuff like that they rapidly found hey, that's not necessarily more effective than, say, doing a crossword or something like that. So stop bilking people out of their hard-earned money. They also weren't necessarily more effective in developing those skills than a regular video game that people just play for fun. They've found, they've attempted learning through video games, gamified learning. They found that was less effective than, direct teacher attention, which, makes sense because, now that's a good teacher, right? If you got a bad teacher, maybe you're better off with the game. These things are not simple. And what I predict we're going to get is a bunch of correlations and very little causation, because the brain does adapt. The brain is plastic. The brain does what you make it do. And much like the, television cultivation theory studies of the 1980s, like the 1960s through the 1980s, people make a lot that isn't there of those studies. There's no way to isolate like one particular TV show that is bad for you as opposed to another type of TV show. It was like mass, people watch a lot of TV, and that includes factual programming like, local news. They had a dimmer view of the world. They found the world to be a scary, more violent, more unfair place than people who watched less TV. Now, again, did TV cause this? Not sure. That's where we get into the displacement theory, the reinforcing spirals theory, the upward social comparisons theory, all that stuff. It's probably a complex combination of factors that have as much to do with things that people aren't getting as the active stimulus that they are getting. If you don't have those in real life connections supporting you, you're probably going to have less good results than people who do. That just makes sense, right? But not everybody can control, especially in the short to mid-term, whether you have a great support system around you. So for those people, video games can be an excellent stopgap. And personally, I think that unless there's reason to show concern, to really be concerned if we start seeing not great data coming out as these studies progress, all right, fine. But I find it absolutely absurd that anybody is even bothering telling people no more than 2 hours a day for children under 24 months. Who is iPad babysitting a 2-year-old? Whoever considers that a good idea? I mean, when kids are 2, you're trying to stop them from eating things that will kill them. Why are they? I play a lot of video games. I am big on tech. What the hell, 2 years old? Explain this to me. Or better yet, don't, right? There are some things that just common sense. But the fact that they have to tell people, limit screens beyond 24 months means people are actually doing that. And I'm sorry, that's not the fault of the screen. That's parental neglect, right? Okay, we'll leave that there. Let's move on to the second thing, which is power fantasy. I've talked about this before, but clearly the person who made the commenter missed it. So it's worth revisiting that there isn't anything wrong with power fantasies. And the commenter's correct. There's nothing inherently wrong with power fantasies. There are a lot of things in all media masquerading as power fantasies that are actually fetishes. And that's the distinction I want to make, okay? Some caveats, okay? Badly written power fantasies are badly written, right? And that's the big problem with power fantasies. A lot of them are really badly written. The way I look at the Twilight Saga, for instance, that's a weird, warped female power fantasy. And much third wave feminist power fantasy, it's all about how much a female lead can endure. That is its own form of power. And personally, I can't stand it. They're old, they're cliche, they're not really power. It is proof you have power based on how much you can suffer, as opposed to the fun kind of power fantasy, which allows you to, move things with your mind or shoot lasers or, be super strong. Pick your X-Men power, right? Twilight's especially bad because it comes down to Bella Swan smells good. Therefore, she has all these adventures, and this super dreamy, much older vampire dude watches her sleep, and she gets the shit beat out of her and almost dies a whole bunch of times. But she's loved, and therefore all that's okay. It's terrible, right? It's so much wrong, but it was popular, and that speaks to something. To me, I thought, the WandaVision show that showed a lot of promise bailed out into cheap, Disneyfied female power fantasy at the end with the hackneyed fight between Agatha and Wanda, where Wanda says, I don't need you to tell me who I am, when Agatha had previously spent an entire episode doing just that. That's hackneyed, not good power fantasy. Now, there's a reason that there's a lot of really bad power fantasy out there right now. Power fantasies really struggle to exist coherently in the postmodern era. Because right now, so much is defined by systems of oppression, and you can't create a power fantasy in a framework where everybody but, WSCMs, white, straight, cisgendered men, are somehow oppressed. You just can't, right? They're at odds. You can't create a fun power fantasy like, say, Black Panther using systems of oppression theory. Black Panther literally has to take everything and put it in a fictional place that's been hidden from the world to create a Black power fantasy, right? Because let's face it, Black Panther is so very much Black power fantasy, right? Their science is more, the science is more advanced. Their women are more equal. The Dora Milaje kick all kinds of ass, and they have fucking battle rhinos, man. That is a power fantasy. And that's why, if you don't understand why people freaked out happy over Black Panther, that's a big reason why. The visibility of traditions that were kind of stomped out by colonialism aside, it's just a really good time, right? Where people who are underrepresented in film, certainly underrepresented as powerful people on film, just get to be cool and powerful and tell a story where they are centered. That is the power of power fantasy. And with sci-fi and video games and all that stuff, I mean, going back to J.R.R. Tolkien, a big part of Lord of the Rings is J.R.R. Tolkien creating kind of a passive patriarchal power fantasy with Frodo Baggins. Frodo Baggins wields great power that's, gradually making him sick, and he needs to be literally carried around by his friends. But it is a form of power, right? That guy who needs to be carried through the war still has importance and still is central and still matters. Gee, I wonder why J.R.R. Tolkien would write that story after sitting out most of World War I with trench fever, right? Just saying. Drink break. And I think that, we've lost a lot of the female power fantasies that way. Because if you let women write their own stuff and it's just frivolous, it's full of sex and pretty hair and clothes and stuff like that, and maybe some kick-ass stuff. But to me, Jessica Rabbit is female power fantasy, right? So much woman, right? Ridiculous hourglass proportions, but she somehow manages to keep a bear trap in a gravity-defying dress in case any man gets fresh, right? That has been rewritten with time. But I wasn't very old when Who Framed Roger Rabbit came out, and I found Jessica Rabbit very empowering to the point that, she's making her own way. She's doing her own thing. She's a star in her own right. And so she chooses a guy as a companion, not who's strong and can protect her, not who has all this money, but who makes her laugh. Because she takes care of the rest of her stuff herself with her gravity-defying dress, complete with bear trap and the cleavage, right? we've killed that female power fantasy, and not for the better. We've killed the female power fantasy of Lara Croft. We've killed the apparently not great, like, I admit, I guess I was seeing a bunch of things that weren't there with the female power fantasy of Mortal Kombat. They fooled me based on what they said about how they felt about their own female characters, but that's gone too, right? It's all just, we're not allowed to do that anymore. And that's a problem, because they didn't just take away male power fantasy. They took away everybody's power fantasy except for black media, who doesn't go in for that shit. And there's a, it's not an accident that we're getting, Black Panther and things like that. Media made by black people for black people that is just fun and powerful, at the same time as Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B are recording WAP. The two things go hand in hand. They always have throughout history. I don't have time to get into that now. Moving back to, boring mayonnaise media. We got a problem with our power fantasy. And it's not that there's a problem with power fantasy. It's that we've got a ton of false power fantasy created by the likes of guys like Joss Whedon and Neil Druckmann. Oh, I went there. But Abby is a shining example of a false power fantasy. That's bad power fantasy. I can explain it in one sentence. This idea that Abby is all swole, so she's strong, right? That's not a power fantasy. That's fucking tragic, because muscles don't protect you from a zombie bite. Muscles just give the zombie a bigger target. It makes no sense. There's an example of fetish masquerading as power fantasy. See also the work of Joss Whedon. Joss Whedon apparently got off on these little tiny women who kicked a lot of ass, even though I was a little older when the Buffy TV series came out. I saw the movie and I liked the movie for the campiness, but when they started doing the Buffy TV show, I was really into vampires, really in. And so I had done a lot of research, and one of the things that I had actually researched is how much force it takes to actually drive a stake through someone's sternum. A woman that tiny, most people do not have the upper body strength to do it in one haul like that. But a tiny little twig-armed girl like that certainly can't. The myths about it were if you go back and read old vampire lore, it's deliberately gory because it's a brutal process, taking multiple whacks with a mallet. I know this is gory, but I'm this is not power fantasy. This is an unreasonable expectation that the average person cannot attain. And the minute you get that, you get fetish, right? I mean, what's the difference between Jessica Rabbit and that? Well, Jessica Rabbit, first of all, she's a cartoon. But second of all, she has all this stuff and she's ridiculous hourglass bear crap and all that. But the core of her is she's charting her own path, right? Does Buffy Summers chart her own path? No, she goes from a guy who sex turned him evil because he was finally happy. What? To a guy who is a serial killer whose first victim was his own mother. What? And then she died and came back. That one's not so bad. But the first two, that's when you start seeing the, eroding power fantasy, right? That's not power fantasy. That's misogyny masquerading through a female avatar. And you do get some of that in Western media, with male power fantasy. There's a lot of re-examination right now, in part because of a PBS documentary. Yes, I just said PBS documentary. I'm a nerd, I know. About Ernest Hemingway and how much of Hemingway was manliness and how much of Hemingway was impossible myth, and how much of Hemingway's own real life behavior informs the protagonists he sets. I mean, a similar example would be Lord Byron, right? I mean, Byron just wrecks everybody, he comes into contact with, including like entire governments who eventually kick him out. Now, does that make Byronic characters bad characters? No. It just indicates the potential dark side of power fantasy. Now, there are pros and cons to every type of story. I am not singling out power fantasy as a particular problem in this regard. It's just one of those things that tends to be used in a lazy way just because it's been done so often. I mean, then you go over to video games and you actually go, wait a minute. A lot of the early Nintendo games were really subverting power fantasy, right? I mean, is Super Mario a power fantasy? Well, not really. He's a little plumber guy who's just, I mean, the smallness of Mario until he eats that mushroom, like some people could say, oh, that's a little kid, acting like he's big and muscular, but yeah, one hit and he's back down to tiny man, right? Like, I would maintain Mario is not a power fantasy and Princess Peach is not a reward. Mario is an interactive ballad to the dignity of the blue-collar little guy. That's my take on Mario. As opposed to something like Metroid, where Samus, hardcore, no joke, badass, right? Big difference. Same thing with Link, right? Like Link from The Legend of Zelda. The power, literal Triforce of power, is the bad guy. Link is not a power fantasy. Link is, they hand it right to you, a courage fantasy. And courage fantasies and power fantasies are not the same thing. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with a power fantasy. I mean, look at the Doom games, right? They're great, adrenaline-soaked, gory fun. There's absolutely nothing wrong with those games. They're not trying to make a great point. They're in some ways, they're extended heavy metal music videos. But there's nothing that's a problem with Doom. If you read into the new lore of what they're doing with Doom, it's surprisingly deep. But even on the surface, a guy, running around stab punching alien demons with their own eyeballs. Nobody thinks they're actually going to do that in real life. So, fine, right? You get into some of the more, and I want to watch what I say here, more heavy-handed moralizing in power fantasy. And that's when I start going, the more you try to tack on, the narrower your margin for success is. Like, if you just build a big, splattery, gory, stupid adrenaline rush, it's easier to stick that landing, provided you've got really great gameplay. You try to start making a point, for instance, Grand Theft Auto 4 and Grand Theft Auto 5, they're really trying to be like Scorsese type stuff. And for some people, it works great. Other people, it just totally, I mean, me, I keep bouncing off of it. Because I start questioning, I start challenging the motivations. I start going, well, no, stop talking, characters, do more. Let me decide what I think your motivations are, and your like what it means that you do these things, instead of you telling me what I'm supposed to think. Because in games it's a real challenge. If they tell you what you're supposed to think and you don't agree, you never get that player back, right? As opposed to more nuanced games like, Dragon Age Origins, where you get, Terran Logain's story arc. You can have people debating his choices and his motivations for hours and hours and hours, because the game never tells you what to think. He tells you what his perspective is. Other characters tell you what their perspectives are, and they leave it to the player to decide what to think about it. And that power, that agency, that autonomy in gameplay is actually the power fantasy that matters in video games. There is nothing wrong with making a player feel in control in an interactive medium. That is kind of the point of these things. That is the point of interactivity. Yes, you can have consequences for things, but ultimately, if a player doesn't feel like they are able to reliably and effectively enact their will upon a video game, what's the freaking point, right? And that brings video games into a complete other discussion arena than film and television and power fantasies there, right? Playing a game like Doom and watching an 80s action movie, the action on screen is inspired from kind of similar sources, but the experience of playing it is very different because, let's face it, there's no difficulty in watching a movie. Your butt may fall asleep and your neck may get a little stiff and your mouth gets dry if you didn't get a soda beforehand, but you don't have to do anything, right? Whereas in a video game, you do. You're a part of it. You have to make inputs. Like, it's not the same thing. And I wish more games... I mean, Ghost of Tsushima is a great example of a game, and I know I talk about this game all the time, but it is actually really that good. Ghost of Tsushima is an example of a game that gets the balance right. Jin is clearly very physically powerful, right? The whole game revolves around him and his family, and the wind is his father and the bird is his mother and all that stuff. But he F's up pretty bad in pretty major places in that game. And the game makes you feel it. With great power comes great responsibility. The Spider-Man thing, right? It does a really good job of showing that power can be pretty terrible when you make a mistake. And yet the controls, the gameplay is just so smooth. It's so intuitive. You barely have to think about it. It's just all the inputs. The controller design, the gameplay design on that game is just so good. Mwah, right? So good. At this point, I want to loop back to The Last of Us 2, because I know some guys watch my content and they constantly want to persuade me that The Last of Us 2 is actually a brilliant game because they like it. And here's the problem with that. They like it because it's a game starring women that's actually made from a male point of view. Okay? You can't have a male power fantasy. Sorry, you can't have a female power fantasy that is pretty much how you'd tell a male power fantasy, because male and female in terms of art aren't about literal male and female bodies. They're about normative archetypes. And if your power fantasy is, oh, look, she's a woman that looks, acts, and thinks a lot like a dude, that's not a female power fantasy, guys. That's a male power fantasy. And that's why you enjoy it and somebody like me doesn't. And that's when you get the disconnect, and that's when there's a problem. But that only becomes a problem because there's nothing inherently wrong with a pure authentic, just dyed in the wool, straight up power fantasy of any kind. As long as it's not at the expense of other people, right? Hope that answered your question, commenter. Keep them coming. I like this sort of dialogue. And help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK. Thanks for watching.